Inside Australia's prison system. A growing number of Australians are being put behind bars just as crime rates are heading down. Who is going into jail and why? And when they're released, are we doing enough to make sure they don't go straight back inside? And joining us on the panel tonight, the former New South Wales Attorney-General and practising criminal lawyer, Greg Smith, SC. From the University of Canberra's School of Law and Justice, Associate Professor Lorana Bartels. The Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, Dr Don Weatherburn. And joining us from Perth tonight, rehabilitator and former prisoner himself, Mervyn Eads. And you can join in the conversation as well on Facebook or on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, today, like most days, the news is again full of stories about some pretty horrific crimes, random acts of violence, sexual assaults, alleged terrorist plots, a man who sold 2 rings belonging to the woman his twin brother had just raped and murdered. We hear those stories and we buy bars for our windows and deadlocks for our doors, and we expect our politicians and our police to make us safe by putting those murderers, muggers, rapists and terrorists in jail for as long as possible. But are our fears matched by the reality? Is the justice system working? Are the right people ending up in jail? And ultimately, are our prisons making us any safer? First, let's take a look at the facts. More Australians than ever before are in jail. A shade under 38,000 people were behind bars nationally at last count, more than double per capita than in the 1980s. 92% of prisoners are men. Indigenous Australians make up just 3% of our total population, but over 1/4 of prison inmates. Why are prisoners in jail? The most common offences or charges are assault, drug crime and sexual assault. One of the reasons our prisons are so full, the number of prisoners in jail waiting for their trial or sentencing has gone up more than 20% in a year. And most prisoners have been there before. The bottom line, for taxpayers, around $3.4 billion a year. So let's start by trying to unpick that basic fact. Don Weatherburn, we keep hearing that most crime rates are going down, yet the prison population nationally continues to go up. Is that a paradox or is it cause and effect? We're putting the baddies behind bars and our streets are safer as a result.
Well, it is a paradox in a sense. We've seen 60 to 70% drops in household burglaries, motor vehicle theft, that sort of thing. Robberies come down by 70%. And the prison population at the same time has gone up by a huge amount. Is one connected to the other? Well, partly. We've seen maybe a 5 to 6% contribution for increased imprisonment rates, but by far the majority of the fall is attributable to changes in the economy, the ebbing of the heroin epidemic that occurred between 1980 basically and 2000. So external factors have had a huge role to play. People overestimate the contribution that prison might have made to the reduction.
Greg Smith, you've been on both sides, I guess, as a practising senior lawyer and as a New South Wales Attorney-General. To what extent do you think the law and order debate and the temptation for particularly state political parties around Australia to run heavy on a we're going to make our streets safer, is that leading to people going to jail that perhaps shouldn't be?
I think it is. For example, the Law Reform Commission recommended new types of punishments that were allowed people to be dealt with outside the system with a view to more supervision and better results, in a sense, more rehabilitation. And yet that was 3 years ago. The government hasn't acted upon it. I would have, but I'm not there.
It doesn't make for good news copy to say we're going to spend billions of dollars on keeping people out of jail, rather than, in the case of New South Wales, spending, I think, close to $4 billion on building new jails for an expected expansion of the prison population of maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people.
But it would have saved us a lot of money, which could have been used for hospitals, schools, public transport and other things. But they've got a limited amount of sexiness. Throwing people into jail and throwing away the key is the mantra of some. and it seems to be the attitude of both sides of politics. For a while I tried to stop that, and I had support, but the support whittled.
Yeah, Mervyn, I'm interested in your perspective on this, given that you have now made a career out of trying to stop former inmates going back inside. How difficult is it to get the resources from government and from elsewhere to do that kind of work?
Yeah, very difficult, but at the moment we've got some submission in where the ministers are backing us. Yeah. It was hard for the last 2 years. We're unfunded and delivering a service to my people. But the reasons behind my people going to prison in the first place has a lot to do with systemic poverty as well. I didn't hear no one mention that.
Yeah, so by my people, you're referring to the Indigenous
First Nations people, yeah.
Yeah, and of course we know, Lorana, that Indigenous Australians make up a disproportionate amount of the prison's population. Despite the Royal Commission's 25 years ago looking at this as issue, it just keeps getting worse. Do we have any idea as to why this is?
Look, it absolutely has gotten worse, and in particular, and that figure wasn't there in what we saw before, for women who make up over a third of the prison population, and in particular, and this I think should be very much in our minds in light of what's happened in the Northern Territory, the Indigenous population of juvenile detention is an absolute disaster. There are a number of reasons why it's gotten worse. A lot of those things lie outside the justice system. They are around housing and poverty and education and employment and physical health and mental health and substance abuse. But also within the justice system, there's underutilisation of diversionary tools that might be available for Indigenous people. There's a lack of cultural sensitivity for a lot of our programs, so it's assumed that a program that's designed for a non-Indigenous population will be suitable for an Indigenous population, and that simply hasn't been borne out.
Yeah, Mervyn, can you share with us a bit of your personal story, because it seems that it's not atypical in that for a lot of young men, their first brush with the law comes quite young, and their first taste of incarceration can come in their early teens or even earlier.
Oh, my personal story, from the age of 13, I started going to prison, and you know what I mean. And I didn't stop my criminal activity till 31 years old, and yeah, and it happens like that for a lot of our First Nations people. Look, we've got one in 9 of my people going to prison, and and nothing's been addressed within the prisons or into reintegration so much to stop this. And I will say, no matter what all the statistics are, our people, the underlying issues of homelessness, systemic poverty, unemployed, we in Western Australia here, we've got the highest incarcerated Indigenous children in the world. And if that's not a national disgrace on this country, I don't know what is. And those children eventually end up in the adult system, like I did.
Look, there are 2 reasons why the Aboriginal imprisonment rate's going up, and they don't relate in either case to crime rates by Aboriginal people. They have not increased. What's happened is that courts have become much tougher in their response to violent offences, particularly physical violence and domestic violence and sexual violence, and because rates of violence in Indigenous communities are so high, they've suffered disproportionately for that. So the big growth is in the percentage of Aboriginal people who are being imprisoned for assault. The second area that's really seen a huge growth is the ice epidemic that's spread right through to regional communities. So you've got many more people going in, not for minor drug offences, but for drug trafficking. That's been a big growth. And the third one is breaches of orders. The courts have taken a much tougher view of people who breach orders, so a lot more of them are being locked up. And you'd have to ask, as I think Greg Smith has done, is there another way of dealing with some of these cases? Do we really need to push the jail button first of call? There are other ways of dealing with many of these offences.
So Greg, when you were in that position in New South Wales politics, what pressures were you feeling? Was it coming from Talkback Radio or the Daily Telegraph, or was it coming from the perceived will of the electorate? Why was it seen to be too difficult to look at these other diversionary sort of policies than to lock people up?
We did look at some of them, and we set up the IDAPT program at John Moroney Prison for people with drug and alcohol problems, and there's been a review done by Dom's department recently, a little bit early than need be, but it was showing promising signs. And in that one, people that have a drug problem have intensive treatment for 6 to 9 months, where they're taught how to speak, given skills, and when they're let out, they're mentored. So that the idea is to just keep trying to help. And I'm very confident about that. So that was one thing we did. We got into other programs for young people. Admittedly, in the Aboriginal area, even though they're only 3% of the population, more than 50% of detainees in juvenile detention centres are Aboriginal. Well, that was the figure. And that was a sad start. And then some of them would want to go to jail to see heroes. Yeah. Which is crazy.
On that question, Mervyn, I'm interested, also drawing from your personal experience, you know, because some people will say, look, you know, we need to make youth detention and juvenile detention and justice tougher early on, because otherwise it's, you know, you're catching up with members of your family, or you're meeting people that become sort of perverse role models because they're tough men.
I don't fully agree with that. My people don't go to jail because they want to follow their role models like society thinks. My people go to jail because crimes, I call it crimes of need, not of want. Our people are so entrenched in poverty, you know what I mean, in society. No one understands fully that our people battle day by day for the next feed, and a lot of the children and that. You know, we talk about homelessness and all the underlying issues. A lot of our people don't have much. We have just the welfare services and not much employment in that. And you know, there's not monkey see, monkey do. Our people would rather work and have a good wage and have nice homes and you know have the best like society all does. But
they're the ones that can benefit from treatment outside the detention or prison system, with some supervision and training and education to get out of that habit.
Well, the services that have been delivered to my people by non-Indigenous and the programs that have been written up by non-Indigenous people for my people have not worked. They've failed my people in a big way. What I've designed in Nalamaya at the moment is the closest thing to ever addressing our problem. A service delivery from our people to our people, where we have the solutions. Our people have the solutions to what in our community fails us. You know what I mean? And all government have got to understand and you know let us be the carrier of our own destination. Yeah.
Well, Lorana, a question for you on, because we have seen certainly when it comes to law enforcement and also the instructions that effectively the politicians are giving to the judges and the magistrates, 3 strikes laws, mandatory sentencing laws, all of these kinds of things. How much of a factor are they, do you think?
Oh, look, those things are a significant factor in pushing up imprisonment rates. The difficult thing is that politicians make certain assumptions about what the public wants and assume that this is an accurate reflection of the populace's wishes. I'm actually involved in some research that's been speaking with jury members, and this is building on some earlier research in Tasmania. And the interesting thing about that was these were jurors who had sat through trials, so they'd heard all the facts, they'd heard the facts that the judges were hearing themselves. And even though at the outset they said, oh, you know, judges are rubbish, they're all too lenient, when they were asked to impose sentences, they imposed sentences that were more lenient than the judge, and 90% of them said that the judge's sentence was appropriate. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what politicians, well, rather, a disconnect between what politicians say, which is we are doing what the public wants, and really considered research on what the public, when it's apprised of the relevant facts, actually wants.
Yeah.
The problem really, though, is that politics is, or at least the law and order discussion, is a zero-sum game. The moment the government gives an inch, the opposition uses it to attack the government, and they simply rotate in that position. So one time it's a Liberal government or a Liberal national government attacking Labor when they're in opposition for being soft on crime, then they get in and they have all the responsibilities for trying to manage the prison system, and the moment they give an inch, the Labor Party attacks them. So we're stuck in this crazy situation, which might have made a bit of sense when crime rates were rising, and they were rising right through the 80s and 90s. But now we're into 16th year of falling crime rates. You'd think someone would take a breath, get off the merry-go-round and try something else. But look what happened to Greg when Greg tried to do that, you know. All the shock jocks were howling abuse at him, notwithstanding the fact that everything he was saying was based on evidence. I know this because he was my boss at the time. And I remember
and you provided much of the evidence.
He was copying it, you know. They say a brave politician's not a smart one, but you know, my credit goes out to.
So how do you get that balance right, Greg? When I mean, in New South Wales and other states, there's been a big issue in recent years with the so-called coward punches, the one-punch deaths, and while overall assault rates might be down, there is a perception that whether it's fueled by drugs or young men on steroids getting bulked up, there's some reason why we're seeing a lot of it feels like a lot of young men dying needlessly on our streets in our nightclub districts. So the New South Wales government acted with lockout laws, with mandatory sentences for people that perpetrate these kind of crimes. Is that an appropriate response, or is that's just politics and community outrage rather than addressing the underlying issues?
I think at the time certain actions had to be taken to look like we were fighting back, because we were being attacked for not, because they reckon that we were in the pockets of the AHA, who ran across Hoteliers Association, and the sentences that were being given for the guys that perpetrated these crimes were quite low, and so we brought in we had the lockouts and the limitation on opening grog shops after you couldn't open after 10, things like that, and I personally think they're a good thing in the sense of the fewer admissions to St Vincent's Hospital emergency. It's gone drastically down. But the mandatory sentence I don't think has ever been imposed, because the Court of Criminal Appeal in Loveridge, the Tom Kelly case, increased the sentence to a minimum term of 10 years or something, and that became a precedent, and so there was no need to use those other one-punch laws.
It's an interesting case in point, and we've certainly seen what a revolving door the prison system can become, with the majority of prisoners having been there before. For those of us who've never been in that kind of trouble, we might just think, well, why don't they just stop committing crimes? They wouldn't be back in jail. But of course, it's not that simple, and life can be pretty tough on the outside as well. Our reporter Jade McMillan spoke to one former prisoner who didn't want to be identified, but has a pretty important story to tell.
Music has always given Sydney man Stephen an escape. At 52, he's spent much of his adult life in and out of prison on drug offences.
The longest I did, I think, was 4.5 years at once, but every time I got out, I would never last long, because you're so used to the prison. Getting out becomes abnormal.
Released again 18 months ago, he didn't have anyone to turn to and was facing an uncertain future.
I was just shocked that there was so few places if you don't have support, if you don't have family, where do you go?
Stephen eventually came into contact with the Community Restorative Centre, a service aimed at keeping people who are at risk of reoffending from returning to jail.
Most people don't have a job when they come out, most people don't have somewhere to live, and a lot of people are trying to make significant changes in terms of, say, their drug and alcohol use. Trying to do all of that without a sort of solid base of support is just incredibly difficult.
Stephen now lives in CRC-supported accommodation and takes part in regular counselling as well as gardening and carpentry programs. The centre also reaches out to high-risk prisoners before they're released, offering immediate support once they get out and over the next 12 months.
Just to take them into Centrelink and sort out their payment, take them to housing and sort out a couple of nights of somewhere to stay, that to someone on their own is way too overwhelming.
Claire McMahon works specifically with female prisoners, many of whom are dealing with complex problems.
Living through domestic violence as children, being removed from their families from a young age, obviously sexual assault. So just really horrible, horrible histories that really you sort of think, how are these women still alive?
Really having one person that is genuinely hopeful about your capacity to make a change can be a significant factor in terms of whether or not you're able to bust out of a life that you've been living for a long time.
For people that are putting their hand up for help. You have to have places like this. I make every mistake that you could possibly have a nightmare about, but yeah, you know, I feel there's hope. There's always hope, you know, has to be.
Jade McMillan with that report. Mervyn Eads, you were telling us a little earlier about how you first went inside at the age of 13 and you were in and out until the age of 31. What did you learn in that time and what point did you get to at age 31 where you were able to put that behind you?
I was listening to the response there about government. All governments have failed my people. My people are still the highest incarcerated people in Australia. One in six of us go to prison. Say if it was 1 in 6 Australians that went to prison, that'd amount to 4 million people in now the prison systems. But the prison system itself, it did nothing in the rehabilitation for me. It was all a form of punishment. I got no education, got no realistic life skills from prison. And once I came out of prison, there was nothing out there to direct me or help me into realistic opportunities, and that's what my people face on a daily basis. You know, do 1 year or 5 years.
So what changed for you, Mervyn, when you got to that point at 31? Was it help you received from somebody on the outside, or was it something that you found within yourself? What changed then?
Got married, but it was more within. I'd had enough of going to prison, and you know, I wanted to be there for children and that, and growing up, and or my family and that. Whatever the form of rehabilitation, it's all punitive. Our people do not get no rehabilitation in the prison system, and there's not enough outside. And all the agencies that are addressing or just taking the money outside of the prisons to help offenders, it's just about them lining in their own pockets. No one actually does anything to provide employment, training, education. We're talking about low educated people there. A lot of them come out of the prison system, can't read and write. Yeah. And they've done 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Yeah. They've learnt nothing in the prison system.
Lorana,
the prison system has failed us.
Yeah, I mean, Lorana, in your experience, Mervyn talks about the sense that it was all punishment, it was no rehabilitation from his point of view. Is anyone getting it right? Are they striking that right balance so that they're you know, it's not a summer camp, but it is also giving people life skills and addressing disadvantage and so on?
Well, the first thing I would say is in terms of, you know, what are prisons for? The international human rights law is very clear on this, that people are sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment. So if we want to be good citizens in the international community and honour our legal and moral obligations, this notion that it's got to be horrible and as mean and nasty as you can make it.
So by definition, the punishment is the fact that you are there, you are not there to be punished.
You are deprived of your liberty, and I might add, of course, as you know, just to bring us back to the earlier figures, nearly 1 in 3 is there without having been convicted. So that adds another dimension to it. In terms of who is getting it right, look, I do hear of and see examples of some things that are working, but the reality is all Australian prisons at the moment are struggling with overcrowding. So it's generally accepted that a prison shouldn't operate at more than about 90 or potentially 95% capacity, because there needs to be some extra space for movement of prisoners who can't interact. The national average, according to the Productivity Commission for last year, was 107% of capacity. In the ACT, it was 127% capacity. That's actually improved because they've now extended it. But what this means is, even if you did have what was in principle a good system, and so for example in the ACT we purport to have a human rights prison, it's really very difficult to do anything other than just manage bodies if it's that full.
So how's a human rights prison different to a standard prison?
The premise is very much oriented around rehabilitation. That's part of the recruitment of correctional officers, part of the training of correctional officers. They are trained in human rights obligations. The ACT, as some viewers may not know, is one of only 2 places in Australia that does have human rights legislation. So the prison in the ACT was built around a very different philosophy, but its ability to deliver on that has been very much impeded as those numbers have climbed inexorably.
Can I just chime in here? I mean, look, it's one thing to talk about what's going on in prison, but the crucial thing is what happens when you get out. And when we surveyed, for example, probation and parole officers in New South Wales some years ago, the point they kept making was, well, you can get a job, or you can get treatment, but you can't do both. So you're constantly having to choose between finding accommodation, trying to find treatment, trying to find a job. 6 things have to go right to stay out of jail. 1 thing alone is enough to get you back. So the crucial thing is when you leave prison, making sure the services and support are there so that you're not tripped up by lacking a home. So you're not tripped up by virtue of the fact that you're back on the grog and no one's watching. So you're not tripped up by any one of a myriad of things that can go wrong in your life and send you straight back from where you came. So, I mean, it's after release that really matters.
And not only not tripped up, but that you've got the support, as Mindy was saying, to help you every step along the way. 1/3 of prisoners are homeless the first night they come out. A large proportion have those mental health issues. They need help to actually do life on the outside.
Yeah, it's a lot cheaper to deal with people at that stage than it is to put them into prison. It costs about $200 a day.
300.
Or perhaps 300.
And you had something to add there.
The basic necessity is housing. How come the governments don't network amongst their own departments and organise housing? It's these little underlying issues that are a major factor. Accommodation, someone having accommodation to set their families up, to have a home for their children, that's a basic necessity. How are they going to get involved in any training or employment, any other opportunities when they're going surf couching from couch to couch without a home? That basic necessity of a home is not given to our people. I think government departments need to start networking amongst themselves, corrective services, State Housing Commission, and you know, health and all these other things. Need to start working with themselves to address the full underlying issues that send people to prison and the reintegration of prisoners once they're released. To make the incarceration rate decrease or reduce, they've got to have a look at the holistic approach of all, not bits and pieces.
Yeah, a quick question for you, Greg Smith, before we're just about out of time, but how much responsibility does the community have to bear in all of this? We talked about the fear and uncertainty that we feel when we hear of criminals and we see repeat offenders out there, and we want somebody to just take care of them so this perceived threat to ourselves and our families goes away. And yet we've heard from Lorana and Mervyn and Don about the fact that we should be doing this so much better. Can you sell to the public the idea that we have to take a more humane approach?
Well, I think yes, but you've also got to sell to the public the fact that, look at their area, there hasn't been much trouble there. You're safe in your home. When do you ever hear of law-abiding citizens having their homes invaded? It's generally criminals that have got the stash that get their homes invaded. And you've got to just convince people to be confident.
Take a look at the crime statistics. At the end of the day, they are going down. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this special edition of The Drum. Thank you very much to our panellists tonight, Greg Smith, Lorana Bartels, Don Weatherburn and Mervyn Eads in Perth. Julia Baird will be your host tomorrow night. I'll see you on Friday for Planet America and back here next week. Have a good night. Bye for now.